Hello, good evening, good day, everybody, and welcome back to Geostrategy with me, your host Abhijit Chavda. Today we are doing episode 13. The world is a very rapidly changing place. These days, in the third decade of the 21st century, you have more happening in a week than you used to previously happen in a year in the 20th century. So, a lot to discuss. A lot has happened since the last time we did an episode, which was episode 12. And as always, this is a forward looking show, and we're going to talk about what's happening right now and how it could impact the world going forward. What are the developments that could happen going forward? We're going to analyze some of the forecasts we have done in the past weeks and so on. Just a reminder that this program is best seen on a larger screen, not on a small screen, because there's going to be a presentation that I'm going to be showing you. There's going to be data on the screen. You would want to ideally watch it on a larger screen. So let us begin with an analysis of past forecasts. So in this show, generally in a typical episode, I do about 2 or 3 forecasts of what's going to happen going forward in the future, maybe over the next week, next few months, maybe the next 6 months, sometimes over a year. That's the kind of forecasting I do. And I give various scenarios, multiple scenarios for each forecast with probability percentages, right? So it's important to keep reviewing this from time to time for the sake of transparency and accountability, and so that it's always a good practice to review the forecasts. Otherwise, there's no point issuing forecasts if you don't review it, right? There's got to be accountability. So let us begin today's episode with, for a change, I generally start with the most important developments of the past week, but today let's begin with a review of past forecasts. So, yeah, a review of past forecasts, success or fail. It's very important to see whether you have succeeded or failed. So it's going to be a hard evaluation of the accuracy of previous forecasts that I have made against what's actually happened in the days after I made the forecast. So this is an exercise in providing transparency to you, my audience, and accountability in my analytical process. So what's the first forecast that I'm going to review today? The first forecast is a forecast I made in episode 11 of Geostrategy on the 3rd of July. So this is a matter of public record. This forecast I made is on my channel in that episode. You can go and watch it if you want. So that's the first forecast. It was about India's proactive counter leveraging via the Tibet card in the India-China relationship. So the forecast I made, and I said that in a departure from India's traditionally cautious stance, India will subtly but deliberately increase the political visibility of the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan government in exile, which is based out of Dharamshala. And this shift aims to signal to Beijing, to China, that India holds counter leverage in the relationship. And India will not be passively pressured, because China has been amping up the pressure on India the past few months, ever since Operation Sindoor happened, in a variety of ways. They've essentially imposed de facto sanctions on India in a variety of ways. And they are now very open about their alliance with Pakistan. So India is now, I said in this forecast, that India will now proactively counter leverage via the Tibet card. So what are the scenarios that I had provided? Let's take a look at that. The scenarios. There were three scenarios, 3 Tibet card forecast scenarios. Scenario A was high-profile public engagement with the Tibetan leadership. I said there would be a probability of 70% of this happening, and a time horizon of 30 to 60 days. It would happen. If it will happen in the next 30 to 60 days, that's what I had said. And the scenario is that senior Indian government officials, maybe cabinet ministers or something like that, will publicly meet with the Dalai Lama or congratulate the Dalai Lama on a significant occasion, like the 90th birthday of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, for example, is an example. And the Indian government may also increase funding or logistical support for Tibetan cultural and religious institutions in India. And all of this will be highly publicized. That was scenario A. Scenario B was that the Indian government will facilitate the Dalai Lama's travel to a sensitive area. I said there is a probability of 35% of this happening over the next year, a time horizon of 365 days. So the government of India will approve and facilitate a visit by the Dalai Lama to a strategically sensitive border area, such as, for example, Tawang in Arunachal Pradesh or Ladakh. Once again, it's a sensitive border area, and this will be framed as a purely religious pilgrimage. Scenario C that I had provided was upgrading diplomatic engagement with the Tibetan government in exile. I said this would have a low probability, about 10%, and the time horizon would be the next year, next 365 days. And in this scenario, India's Ministry of External Affairs will formally, in this scenario, invite the Sikyong, the president of the Tibetan government in exile, for official talks, or an Indian official will publicly attend a Tibetan government in exile formal function, effectively granting the body quasi-official recognition. These are the three scenarios I had provided with the corresponding probabilities and time horizons in episode 11 of Geostrategy. Now let's find out which of these forecasts, if any, have materialized. So what we find is that India's handling of the Dalai Lama and the Central Tibetan Administration, the CTA, since the day I made this forecast, shows a discernible uptick in political signaling towards China, towards Beijing. And evidence from the past 2 weeks since I made that forecast, the evidence reveals that scenario A and scenario B have already occurred in full, well within the respective time horizons. And scenario C is partially, but only cautiously underway. So I gave time horizons of 30 to 60 days for scenario A, 365 days for scenario B, and 365 days for scenario C. But scenario A and B have already occurred in full, completely, well within the respective time horizons. And scenario C is, well, kind of cautiously, partially underway. So let's take a look at the chronology of what's happened thus far since I made this forecast. And so this is a chronology in July 2025. So on the 6th of July 2025, India's Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, he publicly greeted His Holiness Dalai Lama on his 90th birthday. And these birthday wishes were relayed to 1.4 billion Indians. And the Prime Minister's post on Twitter, X, and the Press Information Bureau of India, this amplified the message nationwide, right? And also on the 6th of July, once again, India's union ministers, Mr. Kiran Rijiju and Rajiv Ranjan Singh, and the Arunachal Pradesh Chief Minister, Mr. Pema Khandu, the Sikkimese Minister, Mr. Sonam Lama, all these high-ranking Indian government officials, they attended the birthday celebration of the Dalai Lama in Dharamshala. And this event was organized by the Central Tibetan Administration. It was live streamed, and there was widespread domestic and foreign press coverage of this event. Well, that's pretty significant. Then, essentially, immediately after this, the Chinese lodged a formal protest against with India over the attendance of this event by the ministers, and also about the Prime Minister's greetings to the Dalai Lama. And the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson Mao Ning cited high sensitivity of Tibet issues. So the Chinese immediately lodged a formal protest with India. Then on the 12th of July, well, we amped it up. India amped it up. On the 12th of July, the Dalai Lama was flown by an Indian Air Force jet from Dharamshala to Leh, Ladakh, the Union Territory, right? And this was not some small Air Force jet. It was one of the largest Air Force transport aircrafts that we have, one of those huge black jets, right? So the Dalai Lama was flown by the government of India in an Indian Air Force jet to Leh. And the Union Territory Administration provided Z plus security to the Dalai Lama. And I think the District Commissioner of Leh chaired various preparatory meetings for the various events that would later ensue. Then from the 12th to 17th of July, there was a month-long Ladakh itinerary that unfolded. the Ladakh police was very much involved in this, in crowd control. Medical and sanitization cover was mobilized. Thousands of people lined the 9 kilometer route uh, that the Dalai Lama would he travel along. Right. Then on July 4th and 14th, uh, the, the Union Minister Kiran Rijiju publicly backed the Dalai Lama's sole authority to choose his successor. And this statement by the government of India totally contradicts Beijing's 2007 reincarnation rules. So, well, we are taking a clear stand in this matter. And for the financial year 2025-26, the government of India has continued a 40 crore rupee 5-year grant in aid to the CTA, the Central Tibetan Administration, and the Central Tibetan Relief Committee. And this financial line item has survived the 2024-25 budget cycle. Right? So all of this has happened since I made the forecast just about 2 weeks ago. A lot has happened. And this clearly tells you that scenarios A and B have been fulfilled. Now let's take a detailed look at scenario A for starters. So scenario A was high-profile public engagement of the government of India with Tibetan leadership. And the forecast window was 30 to 60 days by early September 2025. And this has been achieved in the first week of July itself. Right? So there's been cabinet level visibility. Prime Minister Modi's nationwide greeting portrayed the Dalai Lama as an enduring symbol of love, compassion, patience, and moral discipline. Union ministers attended the CTA-run birthday gala in Dharamshala. Arunachal Pradesh and Sikkim cabinet ministers added border state political weight to the various events. There was amplified funding and support. The Home Ministry reaffirmed a 40 crore rupee grant in aid for Tibetan settlements through 2025-26, which signals sustained institutional backing for the Tibetan cause and for the Tibetan diaspora in India, refugees, etc. Local administrations in Dharamshala, in Kullu, they provided public venues and security and logistics for the year-long 90th birthday year of compassion events. The publicity level has been national mainstream outlets like the Times of India, Hindustan Times, NDTV, etc. These national mainstream outlets live blogged or live vlogged the festivities, and international media like DW, like Al Jazeera, etc. They covered the anniversary and the Chinese reaction, the Chinese protests. Right. So overall, the net assessment is that scenario A's triggers, cabinet minister participation, public messaging, resource allocation have all occurred within days of me making the forecast. And China's prompt diplomatic protest, it tells you that the strategic signaling has immediately had an impact on China. So scenario A is completely achieved in the first week itself. No need to wait 30 to 60 days. It was achieved in the first week itself. What about scenario B? Scenario B was facilitating the Dalai Lama's travel to a sensitive border area. And my forecast window was 365 days, July 2026. The status is that this was fully realized by the 12th of July. So less than half a month, less than 10 days essentially. And it was fully realized because the Dalai Lama traveled to Ladakh. The Ladakh visit happened. So there's been government facilitation of this. The Dalai Lama was transported on a gigantic Indian Air Force aircraft, which reflects state-level logistical sponsorship of the visit. Yes, the Ladakh Union Territory convened multiple interdepartmental meetings in Leh, the Deputy Commissioner of Leh, the Tourism Secretary, the Chief, somebody in Kargil as well, for traffic, for medical and security-related arrangements. Then, obviously, the region that the Dalai Lama has visited is a strategically important region, the strategic geography, whether it's Leh, whether it's Shavatsel, whether it's the Zanskar region where the visit will further continue. Yeah, all of these regions, they fall adjacent to or possibly inside Indian territory that the Chinese, for some reason, are claiming. Right? So clearly sensitive geography, and the route of the travel, it essentially parallels the line of actual control flashpoints in eastern Ladakh since 2020. And when it comes to public reception and media, well, tens of thousands of people lined the 9-kilometer airport to residence route. And this event was live streamed on the Dalai Lama's official channels. And the Indian press has emphasized the Z plus security given to the Dalai Lama. And this clearly shows that there's a very high level and complete state endorsement of the Dalai Lama's trip to Leh. So essentially, the assessment for scenario B is that by enabling and openly publicizing the Ladakh tour, India has delivered precisely the high impact non military signal that I had envisioned in scenario B. So scenario B is fully realized. Now let's take a look at scenario C as well. Scenario C was about, so this has a low probability, 10% of happening over the next 365 days. And this scenario is about upgrading the diplomatic engagement with the Tibetan government in exile. So, what's happened thus far? The status is that this scenario is partially realized. There is momentum that's visible, but there's been no Ministry of External Affairs level formal invite yet, right? So the indicator of this scenario coming true would be a formal MEA invitation to the Sikyong, the president of the Tibetan government in exile. And there is no public record of the MEA offering such an invitation to Mr. Penpa Tsering, the Sikyong, for any official bilateral talks until today, right? So it's not fulfilled yet. So we have, a sitting union minister attending a CTA-run event, a formal function. Kiran Rijiju and other dignitaries attended CTA-organized 90th birthday ceremonies, and so on. So that's happened. Parliamentary interface. So an all-party Indian Parliamentary Forum for Tibet met in Delhi with CTA representatives, right? And the MPs, they plan to table Tibet motions in Parliament. So that portion is fulfilled. So the parliamentary interface is fulfilled. The official attendance part is fulfilled, but there has been no MEA invitation. So how do we interpret what's happened thus far vis-a-vis scenario C? The attendance by a sitting union minister at a CTA-run event, it crosses China's traditional red line of keeping the Tibetan government in exile at arm's length. Right, so we have crossed that red line of the Chinese, but the Ministry of External Affairs has maintained a position, an open, official position of that we have no political position on matters of faith, and this suggests that the government of India is calibrating its engagement to avoid a full-scale diplomatic rupture with China. So scenario C is right now, a door that's half open. A door that's ajar. It's not fully closed, it's not fully open, it's half open. And the road to quasi-official recognition has been kind of opened, cracked, the door has been cracked, but it's not been flung wide open. So that's the situation right now. So let's do an integrated assessment of this forecast, right? What's the integrated impact assessment? Scenario A, the outcome has been achieved. The strategic implication of this, what's the geopolitical impact of this? This signals India's readiness to use the Dalai Lama's public stature for leverage, and this has provoked routine but sharp protests from China. Scenario B, once again, has been fully achieved. And what's the geopolitical implication of this? This raises the stakes along the LAC, especially after the events of 2024, the so-called disengagement that may have happened to some extent, right? So we've had the disengagement deals. So it raises the stakes along the line of actual control without crossing any kind of military threshold. So this demonstrates that India is willing to tolerate Chinese displeasure. India is okay with the Chinese being displeased. It's not a red line for us anymore. We are not, we are not. We no longer care about displeasing the Chinese to some extent, and we are willing to do it in a calibrated manner. So that is scenario B. Scenario C, the outcome is partially achieved. The impact of this is that we are incrementally normalizing the government of India's contact with the Tibetan government in exile. This is obviously short of formally diplomatically recognizing the Tibetan government in exile. So we are keeping the escalation dial, the dial at manageable. Right now it's manageable. Maybe in the future we can amp it up, or perhaps bring it down, depending on uh, how things are. Right. So let's take a look at future outlook. Right. So what are the high probability trends? So there's a 60% or more probability of two things happening in my assessment. There could be additional cabinet level appearances at the Central Tibetan Administration's Year of Compassion events, and there could be more state level grants and land regularizations for Tibetan settlements, which could echo the 40 crore rupee scheme that we just discussed. So, in my assessment, I think there's a 60% or higher probability of these two things happening. Now, there are moderate probability trends, which is about 30 to 60%. Let's say average 45%, right? So, in my assessment, two things have this probability, 45% or so. Uh, a second sensitive area pilgrimage by the Dalai Lama, potentially Tawang, perhaps by July 2026, which will obviously depend on the Dalai Lama's health and security assessments. And secondly, there could be the passage of non-binding Tibet-related resolutions in the Indian Parliament or various state assemblies, which could leverage the new cross-party forum. And then there's low probability moves, 20% or less probability of this happening. First of all, there could be a MEA level bilateral meeting with the Sikyong, the president of the Tibetan government in exile, or a formal visit to CTA headquarters, Central Tibetan Administration headquarters. If that happens, it would mean that scenario C is also fully fulfilled. And this would definitely trigger a major diplomatic response from Beijing. And secondly, there could be an announcement of joint India-US programs on Tibetan cultural preservation inside maybe Arunachal Pradesh or Ladakh. So that these are the things that could, these are the scenarios that could come true through the first quarter of 2026. So 60% probability, 45%, and 20% as well. And we will keep an eye and we'll keep track of this as well. Now, so finally, what's the conclusion of this? So, like I said, within just 2 weeks of my forecast in the beginning of July, India has already executed the two higher probability scenarios. And India has already advanced halfway into the lowest probability scenario as well, scenario C. So these are calibrated steps. High profile ministerial participation, logistical state support for Ladakh, but there's no MEA level interaction or handshake with the Sikyong yet. So all of this, it reflects the Indian government's strategy of incrementally raising the Tibet issue's visibility while preserving wiggle room for future engagement with China. So India's Tibet card is now in active play, and China's early protests suggest that this message has landed home in China. And so we're going to have to continue to monitor whether the next steps that the Ministry of External Affairs takes, what kind of outreach it does or does not do with the Tibetan government exile. And this will determine whether scenario C reaches full maturation in the next 365 days, which was the time frame of the forecast. Right. So that's about forecast one, India's Tibet card, which has remarkably come true to a very large extent very rapidly. Now let's take a look at the second forecast. My second forecast was made on the 1st of July 2025, episode 11 of Geostrategy. And the forecast was that NATO's 5% target will ignite a European defense industrial revolution. So the NATO countries have agreed. It's been a historic agreement to a 5% GDP spending target in the next 10 years by 2035. And this is driven by what they perceive as a joint China-Russia threat to Europe. So the forecast is that this will catalyze a fundamental restructuring of the European defense industry. And it will now move beyond incremental procurement. It will now move towards large-scale industrial consolidation and integration. So, what was scenario A? So let's talk about the three scenarios that I had given. Scenario A was that there would be a major European defense merger or joint venture. I said there's a probability of 70% of this happening over the next 180 days. At least one mega merger or joint venture between major European defense primes will be announced. Maybe Rheinmetall, maybe BAE Systems, maybe Thales, maybe Leonardo, right? Uh, and so this will be announced to create a European champion capable of managing continent scale projects spurred by these new massive these spending targets. That is scenario A, a major European defense merger or joint venture. Scenario B was transatlantic defense industrial friction between NATO, between the European nations and the United States. And in my assessment, this had a 30% probability of happening over 75 to 90 days from the date I made the forecast. So in this scenario, the EU will formally adopt procurement rules that favor European consortiums, which will lead to public disputes with the United States or market access for American defense firms, despite the shared threat perception. The Americans want everyone to buy their weapons, but now the Europeans will start, well, if you force them to ramp up the budget, they're going to do what's required. So they will favor European consortiums, which will lead to friction with the United States. And Lithuania's warning against breaking from the US defense industry will prove prescient. So that was scenario B. And what was scenario C? Formal Russia-China military technological alliance. And in my assessment, this had a less than 30% probability with a time horizon of 45 to 90 days. So in this scenario, Russia and China, in a direct response to the NATO spending surge, these two nations, Russia and China, will announce a formal military technology sharing treaty, which will now move beyond ad hoc cooperation between the two nations to joint R&D and production of next generation weapons systems. So these were the three scenarios that made up the forecast. Now, so let's try and validate. Let's do a validation. Let's analyze this 5% spending target and the European defense industrial revolution. Which forecast scenarios have materialized? So the forecast I made on July 3 has been validated by subsequent developments. NATO's historic agreement to a 5% GDP defense spending target by 2035 has indeed catalyzed a fundamental transformation of European defense industries. There's been significant progress across multiple predicted scenarios, not just one scenario, but multiple predicted scenarios. Let's take a look at these scenarios individually. Scenario A, major European defense merger or joint venture confirmed. This scenario has materialized with remarkable precision, well within the predicted time frame of 180 days. So multiple major European defense mergers and joint ventures have been announced and approved. Which are these? First of all, we have the Rheinmetall Leonardo joint venture, the German federal cartel. So this the German federal cartel office has approved the creation of Leonardo Rheinmetall military vehicles, LRMV, a 50-50 joint venture targeting a 50 billion euro European market. There's the BAE Systems Leonardo Japan Aircraft Industrial Enhancement Joint Venture. This has been approved for the Global Combat Air Program, developing sixth generation combat aircraft. Then there's aerospace alliance initiatives. Leonardo, Airbus, Thales are actively assessing the feasibility of a space alliance, Project Bromo, by the end of July this year. And the objective is to compete with Elon Musk's Starlink. So this represents a broader consolidation trend way beyond traditional defense sectors. They now want to compete with Elon Musk's Starlink. I've been saying for the longest time, India should compete with Elon Musk's Starlink, but India is not showing any such ambition. The Europeans now, who have been spurred on, who have been forced into increasing their budget, their defense budgets, are now gearing up to compete with Elon Musk's Starlink. So this prediction, scenario A, its key assumptions have also been validated. European governments are prioritizing pan-European projects over national champions. Okay, not just one nation, but multiple pan-European projects. And the scale of the new defense budgets has made existing company structures insufficient for continent scale projects. So there's going to be significant churn in the European defense industry. So, scenario A confirmed very rapidly. What about scenario B? Transatlantic defense industrial friction. Well, this has also been confirmed. So this scenario has also materialized well within the predicted 75 to 90-day time frame. The European Union has formally adopted procurement rules that favor European consortiums over foreign suppliers like the American suppliers, and this is leading to tensions with the United States. So first of all, there's the European Defense Industry Program, the EDIP. EU ambassadors have reached a preliminary agreement on the $1.5 billion EDIP, which caps non-EU components at 35% and requires EU companies to retain modification rights. So the US has officially protested. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has explicitly told his European allies that he wants them to continue buying American-made arms. So you can see directly, immediately, there's friction, transatlantic friction, clearly. And the EU has implemented strict eligibility criteria requiring that contractors have to be established in the EU or associated countries with at least 65% of the components originating from the EU. So the prediction that Lithuania's warnings about breaking from the US defense industry would prove prescient has been validated, right? As the Baltic states have indeed expressed their concerns about rigid eligibility rules that could potentially disrupt supply chains. So scenario B has been fully confirmed. What about scenario C? Scenario C was about Russia-China military tech alliance. This has been partially confirmed. So a formal military technology sharing treaty has not been announced thus far. We're just 2 weeks into the forecast. So it's not been announced thus far, but Russia and China have indeed significantly deepened their military technical cooperation. So the two presidents, Mr. Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, have issued their strongest joint statement to date, pledging to deepen practical cooperation on maintaining and strengthening global strategic stability. This is some of the most explicit anti-Western language used by the two leaders since the Russia-Ukraine war began. Then there's work on technology sharing. Russia is sharing highly sensitive military technologies with China, with approximately 60% of foreign components in Russian weapons originating from China. Then there are joint military exercises. The Russians and the Chinese have increased the frequency and complexity of their joint military exercises with plans for continued joint drills in 2025. So all of these developments, they definitely fall short of a formal treaty. So it falls short of formal treaty, but the practical cooperation has indeed intensified beyond the ad hoc cooperation baseline. And it's moving towards joint R&D and production described in my prediction. So it could happen. We'll have to keep an eye on scenario C. Now, what about the triggers and monitoring items? So these have been validated. Germany is militarily expanding. The German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has announced that Germany would build Europe's strongest armed force, with plans to spend 3.5% of GDP on defense and create the continent's most capable military. Why? Right? There's the EU Defense Fund. The European Commission has allocated over 1 billion euros through the European Defense Fund for 2025, with plans for a massive 131 billion euro defense and space fund in the next budget cycle. So this represents a five-fold increase from previous allocations. So we are seeing significant moves in that direction. Then there is multi-billion euro procurement plans. European nations have announced procurement plans exceeding $11 billion euros through the IDIRPA program alone, with Germany planning over 160 billion euros annually in defense spending by 2035. So these triggers, these monitoring items that I had made, provided as part of the forecast, these have been validated. So what's the conclusion? The conclusion is that this prediction has proven to be remarkably accurate. The 5% NATO target has triggered exactly the type of European defense industrial revolution that was anticipated in the forecast. Scenario A, major European defense merger or joint venture, and scenario B, transatlantic defense industrial friction, have been fully confirmed within the predicted time frames. And scenario C, Russia China military tech alliance, has partially been validated through significantly enhanced cooperation, which is still short thus far of a formal treaty. So the formal restructuring of European defense industry is proceeding as predicted in the forecast. It's moving significantly beyond incremental procurement. It's moving towards large scale industrial consolidation and integration. And this is going to fundamentally alter the global defense industrial landscape and the transatlantic security relationship between the European nations and the United States. So that's the second forecast, which, well, it has proven to be remarkably accurate. Now let's take a look at a third forecast. This was India's strategic autonomy under the Trump administration. This was on the 1st of July, episode 10 of Geostrategy. Uh, and the forecast was that the confluence of extreme US trade pressure over Russian oil, unresolved border tensions with the US and China backed Pakistan, and deadlocked US trade negotiations will force India to make a decisive strategic choice. So let's take a look at the various scenarios that we had. So scenario A was pragmatic balancing. There were four scenarios that I had given as part of the forecast. Scenario A was pragmatic balancing with a 70% probability over 15 to 45 days. In this scenario, India will secure a limited trade deal with the US before the July 9 tariff deadline and obtain temporary waivers from the US bill targeting Russian oil imports. In return, India will increase naval cooperation with the US while continuing to purchase Russian oil. Scenario B was a reluctant tilt to the West, which essentially means de facto vassalage of the US. I said this has a probability of 15% over 30 to 60 days. So, faced with the threat of crippling 500% tariffs, India will agree to cap or modestly reduce Russian oil imports. In return, the US will drop the tariff threat and finalize a limited trade deal. Scenario C was that Trump will force multi alignment, 10% probability, 30 to 90 days time horizon. So in this scenario, Trump will implement economic measures against Indian companies and significantly reduce US-India defense cooperation. And in response, India will have to accelerate its partnerships with France, Russia, and Israel. And scenario C was a surprise de-escalation with China, probability of just 5% over 60 to 90 days. So in this scenario, China will offer significant concessions on the border dispute, leading to de-escalation that reduces India's security dependence on the Quad and the US and gives it more maneuvering room to defy the US. So the question is, which of these scenarios have materialized? So based on the comprehensive analysis of the events that have occurred since the prediction, scenario A, pragmatic balancing, has largely come to pass. But there are some concerning elements that are now raising their head. These elements are from scenario B. They are beginning to manifest themselves. So this is a work in progress. Obviously, everything is a work in progress. So let's see. What is scenario A? Pragmatic balancing. So what are the confirmed elements of the pragmatic balancing? First of all, trade deal negotiations. So India has successfully secured an extension beyond the July 9 tariff deadline. And negotiations, the deadline has essentially now been pushed to the 1st of August 2025. And Trump has been repeatedly saying that he was close to making a big deal with India, which suggests that that negotiations are ongoing and the US is not considering any immediate punitive action. Secondly, Russian oil. So India has maintained its Russian oil imports while navigating this pressure of US sanctions, potential US sanctions. And there have been new sanctions, US sanctions on Russian oil tankers and companies. And despite that, India has and India has adapted by requiring certificates of origin and seizing deals with sanctioned vessels. Then there is, like I said, enhanced naval cooperation. So on the 12th of July, the Indian Navy and the USS Theodore Roosevelt Carrier Strike Group conducted enhanced naval cooperation joint exercises in the Western Indian Ocean, the so-called Arabian Sea region. And Both nations have maintained their strategic partnership, right? Both nations have finalized new 10-year defense framework expected to be signed this year, 2025. And defense technology cooperation has accelerated with new autonomous systems partnerships. So these are the confirmed elements of scenario A. So scenario A is largely fulfilled, but there are concerning deviations, and there's the emerging risk of scenario B, which is a reluctant, forced tilt to the West. So what's happening? So what is happening right now as we speak? There is increasing, intensifying congressional pressure on India, the US Congress. Senator Lindsey Graham, his Sanctioning Russia Act of 2025 has gained unprecedented bipartisan support in the US Congress with 85 co sponsors. This bill proposes 500% tariffs on countries that purchase Russian oil. And this directly targets India as the second largest buyer of Russian crude. Then there's Trump's hardening stance towards India. So Trump issued a 50-day ultimatum to Russia in July this month, threatening 100% secondary sanctions on countries trading with Russia. So this is a significant escalation beyond the predicted tactical tensions. This is like a blanket ultimatum to all the nations that are trading with Russia, and this directly impacts India again. And there are complications when it comes to the trade deal. Uh, so there was this deadline for India-US trade deal, at least a small interim trade deal, which was July 9. So this deadline has come and gone. So the deadline has failed. And why did it fail? It failed precisely because India refused to budge on agricultural and dairy access, which are areas that I identified as sensitive in my original forecast. So this deadlock, it suggests that there are deeper structural issues than anticipated in the pragmatic balancing scenario. So that is the emerging risk of scenario B, which is a real and present danger for India, not for the US, for India. And what are the scenarios that have not materialized? Scenario C, which is Trump forces multi-alignment, that has not materialized. There has been no significant reduction in India-US defense cooperation. On the other hand, instead, cooperation has deepened through joint exercises and technology partnerships. And scenario D, surprise China de-escalation. Well, China has explicitly stated that the border issue is complicated. It will take time to resolve. So and no significant concessions or breakthrough announcements have emerged from recent India-China diplomatic meetings. We had high-level diplomatic meetings. The Indian foreign minister met with the Chinese president. Well, nothing has come from that. So these scenarios have clearly not materialized. Scenario A has materialized, and scenario B is raising its head and threatening to materialize, possibly in the coming weeks or months. So, a critical assessment of India's strategic autonomy. The 70% probability that I assigned to scenario A has proven to be largely accurate. But the scenario is now under increasing stress. Scenario B, which has a 15% likelihood, reluctant tilt to the West, it will gain significant traction if the Graham sanctions bill passes and Trump's 50-day ultimatum expires without Russian compliance. And India's continued participation in BRICS activities, Prime Minister Modi's prominent role in the July 2025 summit in Brazil, where he announced India's 2026 chairmanship, all of this suggests that there is significant resistance to complete Western alignment. So that's the situation right now. This is also something that's evolving over time. The situation, the India-US partnership relationship is evolving over time, and we'll have to wait and watch as to what events occur, for example, in the US Congress and so on, which will have a direct impact on which scenarios materialize going forward. Thus far, scenario A has come true, and scenario B is raising its head. So we'll have to keep an eye on this. So what's the outlook? So essentially, the key inflection point will come around August-September 2025, when both the trade deal deadline and potential sanctions legislation, both of these will converge. So India's strategic autonomy faces its most severe threat and test not from the predicted tariff pressures alone, but from the combined force of the congressional sanctions legislation that could fundamentally alter the cost benefit calculation of India's continued Russian energy partnership. The US would want India to walk away from that, and that's what they're trying to achieve. So we'll have to keep an eye on this and wait and watch. And the key inflection point is around August, September this year. So let's keep an eye on that. Right? Okay, that's the deal with some of the forecasts that I had made. Seems to be on track to a large extent. Now let's take a look at the key developments, most impactful developments that have happened in the past week or so. The most impactful developments of the past week. So, first of all, well, this is an evolving, continuing storyline. The Trump administration continues its multi-front global trade offensive. So, the Trump administration has dramatically escalated the global trade tensions by announcing 30% tariffs on the EU and Mexico. They're threatening 100% tariff on Chinese imports. They've issued, like we discussed, a 50-day ultimatum to Russia to end the Ukraine war or face crippling secondary sanctions. What are the signals and indicators? 30% tariffs on EU and Mexican imports scheduled for August 1, and the 50-day deadline for Russia. And there are broader plans that the Trump administration has announced to set tariffs for 150 smaller countries, which indicates a comprehensive restructuring of US trade policy. A blanket comprehensive restructuring of US trade policy. So this is an aggressive multi-front trade offensive. It's a war against the world, a trade war against the world. It indicates that there's a fundamental shift underway in the US towards economic nationalism, and this obviously is going to destabilize and restructure the global trading system. And the US is taking these actions against their key allies like the EU and Mexico, and they are issuing threats to BRICS nations. And all of this, it risks fracturing Western economic cohesion, and it risks pushing American partners and allies closer to China. So this strategy, it uses tariffs as a primary tool of geopolitical leverage, and this is creating a tremendous amount of uncertainty for global supply chains and financial markets. It's forcing nations to choose between economic retaliation and negotiated concessions. So that's the one of the primary, most impactful development of the past week. It's a continuing story. It's been continuing for quite a while. Then you have this development. Russia has rejected the US ultimatum, and it has escalated nuclear rhetoric. So Russia has categorically rejected the Trump administration's 50-day ultimatum for a Ukraine peace deal. And Russia has responded to the US plans for new weapons shipments to Ukraine with an explicit nuclear warning. And this diplomatic defiance, it comes at a time when Russia has launched massive aerial assaults on Ukraine, and Russia is expanding its nuclear infrastructure. So the Kremlin has publicly dismissed Trump's ultimatum as unacceptable and one-sided. And there's been the US has announced a plan to supply Patriot systems to Ukraine. In response to that, Russia has reaffirmed its nuclear doctrine its nuclear doctrine is in force, and Russia has warned that it could be prepared to strike at Western targets. And as we know, as we've discussed in the past, there's been a record-breaking aerial assault that Russia launched on Ukraine in June. 5,681 drones and missiles, and Russia has positioned 160,000 troops for a potential major offensive, and the aerial assaults and attacks continue as we speak. And satellite imagery has shown that Russia is actively upgrading 5 secret nuclear bases across European and Pacific regions. So why does this matter? Why is it important geopolitically? So Russia has this dual strategy of rejecting diplomacy while escalating both conventional and nuclear threats. So this signals its intent to pursue a military solution in Ukraine. It doesn't trust the US administration, the Trump administration anymore. They will say one thing one day and say a totally different thing another day. They cannot be trusted. That's what Russia is signaling to the US. So the Russians want to pursue a military solution in Ukraine, regardless of American pressure. And the explicit nuclear warning aims to deter further NATO support for Ukraine by raising the stakes of the conflict. And this indicates Russia's confidence in its ability to withstand further economic sanctions because of its realigned trade with largely China and India, uh, which also brings India into the mix, right? So this is setting the stage for a prolonged and more dangerous phase of the Ukraine war. Then we have NATO. So NATO has threatened secondary sanctions on China, India, and Brazil over trade with Russia. And this is an unprecedented move. So NATO's Secretary General Mark Rutte, or whatever the name is, he has explicitly warned China, India, and Brazil that they could face very hard secondary sanctions, including 100% tariffs if they continue their economic relationships with Russia. This warning was issued by the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. Uh, and this threat directly aligns with legislative proposals that are underway, like we discussed in the US, for sledgehammer sanctions bill targeting countries that are buying Russian energies. And this warning has coincided with Russian oil exports to China and India reaching an 11-month high. So this warning dramatically expands the economic conflict over Ukraine. It threatens to draw in the world's largest emerging economies and key members of the BRICS coalition, the BRICS bloc. And this threat marks a significant escalation in American and Western pressure tactics, which are moving beyond targeting Russia directly. It's now threatening and targeting Russia's primary economic partners. And this could risk a major confrontation between NATO and BRICS. It could fragment the global economy, and it could force strategic partners of Russia as well as America into an increasingly difficult balancing act between Western allies and long-standing traditional partners. So that's the situation. Now, what else do we have? Yes, we have the Trump threat, right? 500% tariffs on India for Russian oil purchases, like we discussed. This ultimatum that Trump has sent to India, it is designed to force India to choose between economic relationships with Russia and strategic partnership with the US. And this could potentially fracture uh, possibly one of America's most important Indo-Pacific partnerships. Um, and this threat by Trump, it demonstrates his administration's willingness to weaponize economic pressure against, like we have seen over and over again, America's strategic partners. And this could risk the loss of crucial support for China containment efforts, while potentially pushing India towards non-aligned or alternative partnership strategies, like we discussed in the forecasting scenarios that we discussed a while ago. Now, as a response, India has firmly rejected the NATO sanctions threat over India's trade with Russia. India has forcefully rejected a direct warning from NATO's Secretary General that it could face very hard secondary sanctions for its continued economic engagement with Russia, particularly its high volume oil imports. And India has emphasized India's sovereign right to ensure its energy security. So the NATO warning it explicitly targeted India, China, and Brazil. India's oil imports from Russia, have surged to an 11-month high in June 2025, this is last month. And India's oil minister stated that the country, India, is ready to replace Russian oil if necessary. So, yeah. So this signals strategic flexibility and resilience to sanctions pressure. So this is a public confrontation. This marks a pivotal moment in the relationship between the West and India and the global South's rising powers. India has this unwavering commitment to strategic autonomy, like it should. It's one of the few sovereign nations in the world. So India, to preserve its sovereignty, has this unwavering commitment to strategic autonomy. And this comes even when India is under direct threat from the entire NATO alliance. So this solidifies India's position as a leader of the non-aligned bloc, as some would say, but as a leader of the global South, actually. So India is demonstrating defiance, and this challenges the global reach of Western sanctions. and it highlights the deepening rift between the G7 and BRICS nations. And this could potentially accelerate the fragmentation of the global economic order. So it remains to be seen what action India will take in response to sanctions if they actually materialize. This is once again a developing story that we have to keep an eye on. Then we talk about France and Africa. So France has, this is the end of an era for France. France has ended its military era in West Africa, and Russia is stepping in to fill the security vacuum. So France has completed its military withdrawal from West Africa. This ends a long-standing colonial era French presence in Senegal, in Niger, in Mali, and Burkina Faso. This is a strategic retreat by France, and it obviously has created a security vacuum, and Russia is rapidly filling this security vacuum through military cooperation with these nations and the deployment of paramilitary forces like the Wagner Group. Uh, so France's military withdrawal from Senegal, marked the final step in its disengagement from its former military strongholds or footholds in the Sahel region. Uh, Mali's military leader visited a Chinese weapons manufacturer, and Russia has established new military training facilities and media operations across the region. And military governments or juntas in Mali and Burkina Faso have obviously, over the past couple of years, consolidated power. They have dissolved electoral commissions and they are extending their mandates. So, why is this important? Does Africa even matter? Of course, everything matters, everything is interconnected. So, this development is a historic geopolitical realignment in the Sahel region, the so called coup belt in Africa. So, it's a so for the Sahel region, for West Africa. This ends over a century of French military dominance in the region, and Russia's ascendance as the region's primary external security partner fundamentally alters the counterterrorism landscape, like the Americans like to call it, and it gives Russia significant influence over a region that is rich in strategic resources. It's rich in oil and gas and uranium reserves and so much more. So this shift, it challenges the traditional Western French and Western dominance in the region. It challenges Western interests, and it creates a new environment for a different kind of governance system, different kind of foreign influence in the region. And the West would say that it poses long-term stability risks for the continent. Maybe it's the other way around, but we'll have to see. Then the Trump administration has pivoted US Africa strategy to counter China. So this is all happening at the same time. It's one thing is in response to another. So that's how it goes. So the US President Trump hosted the first US Africa summit, which signals a major strategic shift from America's traditional aid-based models for engaging with African countries. So it's now moving from aid-based models to trade-focused partnerships. This new approach by the US, it emphasizes securing access to critical minerals to counter China's growing economic dominance on the continent. Right? It's all about minerals. It's all about resources. They don't really care about democracy, human rights, and any of that, do they? Right? So a major US investment package is expected to target critical minerals extraction in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, South Africa, and Namibia, maybe in the next 3 months or so. And this shift comes as Africa has emerged as a battleground for critical minerals, with China as well as India intensifying efforts to secure resources for electric vehicles and green technology supply chains. And the US is at the same time considering controversial policies to deport third country migrants to African nations, which could undermine the diplomatic goodwill that any such trade focus could generate. So it's always that sort of thing. Anyhow, why does it matter? So this policy pivot represents a significant realignment of US-Africa relations. The US is now going to prioritize transactional economic engagement and resource security over its traditional model of so-called development and governance assistance that never really provided any development or governance assistance to the people of Africa. So the US is now directly competing with China for access to critical minerals. like copper, like cobalt, etc. And by doing this, the US is extending its great power competition with China to the African into the African resource sector. So this could create new opportunities for African nations to leverage these competing interests, but this also risks entrenching neo-colonial extractive patterns by both the US and China. So that's about Africa. Now let's talk about AI. AI. So the Pentagon is accelerating the integration of commercial AI into the military domain, into national security. The Pentagon has awarded contracts worth up to 200 million each to four major AI companies. Google, Google's AI is called Gemini. Then there's OpenAI, which is ChatGPT, that company. Then there's Anthropic, whose AI system is called Claude, and Elon Musk's XAI. So these are the four major AI companies. And the objective is to develop advanced agentic AI technologies for national security applications. So the total contract value is up to $800 million. The focus is on agentic AI systems that are capable of autonomous reasoning and action, which is something that points towards the development of next generation military AI. So agentic AI systems are systems that are capable of autonomous reasoning and action. They don't need a lot of human input. You tell them what to do, and they'll take a whole series of steps and take initiative to to achieve the outcome. That's agentic AI. So that there's the inclusion of both established tech giants like Google and newer, more specialized AI labs like OpenAI, like Anthropic, like XAI. So this dual approach, it reflects a strategy to harness diverse development approaches, which is a good strategy, of course. So this is very important. This is a reasonably massive investment. Maybe it's the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the real deal, but it marks possibly a pivotal moment in the militarization of artificial intelligence. The US is bringing in the leading commercial AI labs directly into the American defense ecosystem. And by doing this, the US aims to rapidly accelerate its military AI capabilities. And the objective is to maintain a decisive technological edge over competitors like China. So, yeah, very important development here. Then we have Japan and East Asia. Japan has designated the China, Russia, North Korea axis as its gravest national security threat. And this was done in the latest in Japan's latest defense white paper. And Japan says that this axis is the gravest threat to global security since the Second World War. And this comes as American B-52s conducted joint operations with Japanese and South Korean fighters for the first time. Japan's assessment warns that the military balance in the Pacific is tilting in China's favor. And this new Japanese posture aligns with American efforts to pressure Japan for more concrete military commitments in a potential Taiwan conflict. So this is an unprecedented and dramatic hardening of Japan's security posture. This provides the political justification for a fundamental transformation of its post-war pacifist doctrine. Japan, since 1945, has had this constitution that was written by the Americans, and their outlook has always been a pacifist outlook. That's what school kids are taught from the time they're 3 years old, that we have to be a pacifistic nation. We don't believe in war. What we did in the past was really evil, and so on. This white paper and this designation, this threat perception, could potentially be the first step in a potential future fundamental transformation of Japan's war doctrine. So Japan has officially labeled these three nations as a cohesive axis, and by doing so, Japan is signaling that it views the actions of these nations, from Chinese maritime pressure to Russia's war in Ukraine, to to North Korean missile tests, and so much more. All of this, Japan regards all of this as a coordinated challenge. And this could possibly accelerate Japan's rearmament. Maybe Japan could acquire counter-strike capabilities, and this could drive possibly further military integration with the US and other regional partners. And these are the moves that are going to reshape the security landscape of the so-called Indo-Pacific region. And then we have India and China. So India and China are pursuing a diplomatic thaw, apparently, to reset relations, right? That's what it looks like. India's External Affairs Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar, conducted his first visit to Beijing in 5 years. And this visit culminated in a meeting with China's President, Mr. Xi Jinping. And both sides verbally signaled a desire to stabilize relations, which have been frozen since we know what happened in 2020, the Galwan clash, right? So Dr. Jaishankar publicly characterized the relations as steadily improving, which is a significant shift in tone from previous years. And China has publicly endorsed reviving the RIC trilateral dialogue mechanism, Russia, India, China. And this meeting comes as Taiwanese investment in China is declining, and tech manufacturing like Apple's iPhone 17 is shifting from China to India, which is creating a new dynamic of economic competition between India and China, and it's altering the economic context of the India-China relationship. So this high-level diplomatic engagement represents a potential strategic recalibration by the two Asian giants, potentially, yes. Both nations are facing very different forms of pressure from the United States, from the West. India is facing pressure over its ties in relationship with Russia, and China is facing pressure over trade and technology. Very different kinds of pressure. But clearly, there's a mutual interest in reducing friction over the undemarcated India-Tibet border, right? The border that China has steadfastly refused to demarcate. So listen, we have to be clear that any kind of resolution, full resolution of the territorial issue, that remains a distant dream. But if a thaw happens, that could de-escalate military tensions, reopen channels for economic cooperation, and significantly alter the geopolitical balance in the Indo-Pacific. Now, will this happen? I think it's highly unlikely. China is openly flaunting its relationship with Pakistan. China openly provided real-time intelligence to Pakistan during Operation Sindoor, the 3-day war. China is currently in the process of imposing sanctions on India, economic sanctions, and so on and so forth. So the Chinese actions are very different from the rhetoric, right? So I think it's highly unlikely a real thaw will happen, but let's keep an eye on this. So this is a good positive development. Now let's take a look at some soft signals. Soft signals are emerging developments that may not dominate headlines right now, but they could end up significantly shaping future geopolitical trajectories. Every storm begins as the flapping of a butterfly's wings, right? So what are the soft signals we should look at? First of all, Trump's Genius Act support boosts cryptocurrency markets. So there is significant Trump administration backing for cryptocurrency legislation. And this signals a major regulatory shift in the US. This could potentially transform the US financial architecture, and it could create a significant conflicts of interest given, like we have discussed, the Trump family business ventures, which are increasingly focusing on the crypto domain. So this development could fundamentally alter the global financial power dynamics by legitimizing cryptocurrency as a mainstream financial instrument under US regulatory oversight. And this policy shift may accelerate de-dollarization trends if other nations develop competing digital currency frameworks, obviously. And simultaneously, the Trump family's involvement in cryptocurrency ventures, major cryptocurrency ventures, including ventures in Pakistan, may I remind you all, right? So this involvement, it raises serious questions about policy motivations, and it could trigger potentially constitutional challenges regarding presidential conflicts of interest, which are very clear and open, right? So this is an interesting soft signal that could become big in the future. Then we have this. The Pentagon has reclassified drones as expendable munitions in a new policy. It's a new policy and it reclassifies certain drones as expendable munitions rather than aircraft systems. So this is a bureaucratic shift, but that could fundamentally alter how autonomous weapons are developed, procured, and employed by US forces. So this is a seemingly minor administrative change, but it could potentially have profound security implications. If you reclassify drones as munitions, then you can dramatically accelerate procurement and deployment. You're essentially classifying drones as ammunition, like shells or bullets, kind of, right? So those are mass produced, aren't they? So by reclassifying drones as munitions, the Pentagon dramatically can dramatically escalate procurement and deployment. This could bypass lengthy acquisition processes designed for aircraft, right? And this will enable faster adaptation to battlefield realities that we see in Ukraine. And it will also lower the threshold for using autonomous systems, and this could potentially lead to more rapid escalation in future conflicts or ongoing conflicts, for that matter. So this signals a strategic shift towards attritable, mass-produced autonomous systems, which will have significant consequences for international norms and arms control discussions regarding lethal autonomous weapons. Interesting soft signal. A third soft signal, this is about India. India has established a domestic maritime insurance club amid the issues related to India's oil imports from Russia. So India is establishing its first domestic procurement and indemnity P&I club for maritime insurance. This move is strategically timed to circumvent potential Western sanctions on shipping and insurance for India's booming oil trade with Russia. So this seems to be a very niche, minor development, financial development, but it's a crucial piece of sanctions proofing infrastructure. So Western sanctions why have they been effective? They have been effective because of their control over global financial and insurance networks. So by creating a sovereign insurance mechanism, India is building a parallel system to protect its strategic trade relationships, particularly its energy imports from Russia, from American and Western economic pressure. So this, you could say, is a tangible step towards de-dollarization and the creation of alternative economic structures. And this demonstrates India's commitment to strategic autonomy, even when it conflicts with Western policy, right? So scenario B seems to be unlikely when it comes to the India-US relations and strategic autonomy. When it comes to when you look at this development, there's one more soft signal that we need to look at. NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang has emerged as the unofficial US-China technology envoy. So Mr. Huang, the NVIDIA CEO, has reportedly persuaded American President Trump to allow the sales of certain AI chips, NVIDIA AI chips, to China. And this positions him as a key unofficial intermediary in US-China technology relations. This shows that there is a growing diplomatic role of technology executives in high-stakes geopolitics. So this is a structural shift where corporate leaders of strategically vital companies can directly shape national security policy. The US government, as we know, will set export controls, the policies. So that will be done by the US government, but the technical complexity and market power of companies like NVIDIA gives their CEOs a unique advantage. So the future of the US-China technology competition may be co-authored in corporate boardrooms as much as in government situation rooms. So this is now we are moving towards a different kind of world. There's a complex dynamic where corporate interests in market access can moderate or challenge hardline national security policies, and this could lead to more nuanced and potentially less coherent long-term strategy as business and corporate interests encroach upon domains where the government usually decides what happens. So these are the soft signals for this episode. Now let's take a look at the top storylines, a couple of top storylines that we should track next week. We have discussed a lot of developments that all need tracking, but let's focus on a couple of storylines for this section. So Trump is causing chaos globally with his tariffs. The global trade system is under strain. And the US is threatening new tariffs on 22 countries. It's supporting 500% tariffs on nations that are purchasing Russian energy. And this represents the most comprehensive challenge to the multilateral trading system that the US created since the Second World War. So the US has created and authored the system. Now the US is systematically dismantling it. Right? What's the latest development? These tariff threats they create a binary choice for global economies between continued trade relationships with sanctioned nations or access to US markets. You either continue your relationship with so essentially the US is telling these nations that if you want to continue your relationship with the sanctioned nations, you can no longer access the US market. If you want to access the US market, you need to end your relationship with the sanctioned countries, essentially Russia and also China. So this binary choice that the US is giving, it is forcing a fundamental realignment of global security, global economic partnerships. So what's my forecast? My forecast is that global trade will fragment into regional blocks by the end of this year, next 6 months or so. So what are the regional blocks? US allied economies, China, Russia aligned economies, and neutral nations that seek to maintain relations with both sides. And the initial fragmentation, in my assessment, will happen over the next 3 to 6 months, and I give this a probability of 70%. Secondly, we have energy-based economic warfare escalation. So Trump has threatened 500% tariffs on India for India's purchases of Russian oil. And he's supporting legislation imposing similar penalties on all countries buying Russian energy. So Trump is transforming energy trade into a tool of geopolitical leverage and coercion. This policy is forcing energy importing nations to choose between energy security through Russian purchases or economic access to US markets. So nations that are not self-sufficient in energy are now faced with this dilemma. So the Americans are weaponizing energy dependencies for political or geopolitical objectives. Right? So what's my forecast? My forecast is that India will reduce but not eliminate Russian oil purchases while seeking alternative suppliers and energy partnerships. Global energy prices will increase because of supply chain disruption, and energy importing nations will accelerate renewable energy development. And the time horizon for the Indian response is 45 to 60 days. And I give 6 to 12 months for the market adjustment. And the probability of this prediction is 80%. Right. So to summarize, what are the key geopolitical trends? There are several interconnected, high impact trends that are shaping the global geopolitical landscape. Firstly, the weaponization of economic interdependence. That's one of the dominant themes that we are seeing right now. The use of trade, technology, and resources as tools of statecraft and tools of leverage. The US is employing widespread tariffs against adversaries, not just against adversaries like China, but also against America's key allies and trading partners like the EU, like Mexico, like Brazil, like China, like Canada, like ASEAN. And the justification is national security. The US national security comes first. Everybody else has to take a back seat. And China is retaliating with its own strategic leverage. China is imposing export controls on rare earth elements, EV battery technology, which are critical choke points for Western green energy and high-tech manufacturing. So we are seeing this tit-for-tat economic warfare, and it's forcing a fundamental restructuring of global supply chains. Secondly, we have the fragmentation and realignment of alliances. So, traditional alliances are now under strange, and new and more flexible security arrangements are forming. The Pentagon is reviewing, like we discussed a couple of weeks ago, the EU-US Pact, the Australia UK US submarine pact, right? Nuclear submarine pact. Um, and there is US pressure on allies for burden sharing that we have seen in NATO, ramp up from 2.55% of GDP to 5% of GDP for defense expenditure. That's been forced on the NATO nations by 2035. We are seeing that. Then there are specific conflict commitments like Japan and Australia on Taiwan. The US wants Japan and Australia to commit to supporting any action in Taiwan in the future, that sort of thing. So all of these actions are creating a tremendous amount of uncertainty, and a trend towards strategic autonomy is accelerating. It's, you could say, it's exemplified by the historic UK France nuclear cooperation agreement that we discussed last week, which is a clear hedge against US potential US disengagement. And at the same time, anti-China security frameworks are solidifying with this new trilateral pact: US, Australia, Japan, US, South Korea, Japan, etc. So the fragmentation and reformulation of alliances. Then you have the solidification of what the West would call an authoritarian axis. The relationship between Russia, China, and North Korea. It's evolving from a loose arrangement, loose alignment, into a more cohesive security and strategic bloc. And we know that North Korea has officially deployed troops to support Russia in Ukraine. And North Korea is receiving Russian diplomatic cover for its nuclear program, and so on. So we are seeing this solidifying right now. There's two more points. Then we have the great technological schism, which is deepening. The US and China, their competition is over advanced technology, particularly AI and semiconductors, and this is the central area of this conflict. The US is attempting to create a technological blockade with strict export controls, AI chips, ASML equipment, etc. So that's what the Americans are doing. And China is responding with a multi pronged strategy. China is circumventing controls, which is, they're building data centers for 115,000 NVIDIA GPUs. The Chinese are developing indigenous alternatives, Huawei's AI Cloud Matrix chip, for example. And China is weaponizing its own supply chain dominance in rare earths, etc. And the partial US reversal on allowing NVIDIA's H20 chip sales to China indicates that this is not a simple blockade, but a complex, managed competition with tactical adjustments, which will keep on coming. So that is the great technological schism, which is deepening. And then we have the rise of an aggressive, or rather assertive, global South. So developing nations and middle powers are increasingly navigating great power competition to their advantage. Why not? So India's strategy is of multi-alignment. It's a prime example. And India is simultaneously negotiating with the US while maintaining high volume oil imports from Russia. India is firmly uh, rejecting NATO's secondary sanctions threats. Um, and Brazil has had this defiant response to aggressive US tariffs. Uh, and we have African nations that are leveraging competition between China, India, and the US and the West for better investment patterns, uh, for better investment terms. This also is following similar patterns. Um, so yeah, that's what we are seeing right now: the rise of an assertive global South. So we have these trends that are dominating uh, and shaping the global geopolitical landscape: the weaponization of economic interdependence, fragmentation and realignment of alliances, so the solidification of the Russia, China, North Korea axis, the great technological schism, and the rise of an assertive global South. And let's see where this takes us. So that brings me to the end of today's episode. I hope that you found it valuable. I hope it gave you some value. So thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe if you feel like it. And I will see you in the next live stream very soon, tomorrow. Ask Abhijit. Look forward to seeing you there. Thank you so much. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.